The richest woman in the room pointed down at her own shoe and ordered the waitress to kneel and wipe it clean with her bare hands. 400 people in Chicago's grandest ballroom watched it happen. The band stopped playing. Glasses froze in midair. A few phones quietly went up. And that 27-year-old girl, her apron still stained with sauce, actually knelt down. But what people would still be talking about years later was not the kneeling. It was the man standing perfectly still at the back of the room. The one nobody in that ballroom dared look straight in the eye. The one who only had to make a single phone call to wipe an entire corporation off the city's map. He saw all of it. And years before that night, he had owed that girl a debt she did not even remember giving away. It happened one late autumn evening, at a charity gala raising money for a children's wing at the city hospital, in the ballroom of the Ashford Hotel on Michigan Avenue. Delaney Hart took that shift because it paid double. She needed double. She needed far more than that. Because on the calendar taped to her refrigerator door in her one-bedroom apartment, there was a date circled in red, and it was coming fast. If this story moved you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone you thought of just now, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. That morning began long before the sun came up. Delaney Hart woke in the one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, where the pipes groaned every time someone upstairs turned on a faucet. And she lay still for a few seconds in the darkness, trying to remember what day it was. Then she sat up and carefully straightened the blanket over the sofa where she still slept. Because the apartment's only bedroom had belonged to Owen for the past 3 years. She walked barefoot into the kitchen, switched on the small light above the sink, and began doing what she did every morning. There were 4 eggs left in the refrigerator. She took out 2. There was a particular kind of arithmetic that people like Delaney learned long ago, the kind they didn't teach in school. The kind that told you 2 eggs today meant 2 eggs tomorrow, and that meant you were still all right. You still hadn't lost. She cracked the eggs into a skillet and beat them with a fork that had 1 bent tine. And while she waited for the pan to heat, she poured milk into the cup with the dinosaur on it, the one Owen had picked out at a thrift store and had stubbornly refused to trade for anything else. She sliced the bread. She put 2 pieces into the toaster. She did all of it in silence, without turning on music, without putting on the news, because she wanted to hear her little brother's footsteps when he woke up. Owen Hart was 8 years old, and he came out of the bedroom with his hair standing straight up on one side of his head. Dragging the faded stuffed animal he still insisted was a dog, even though it looked more like a bear. He climbed onto a chair, rested his chin on the table, and started telling a story before he even remembered to say good morning. He said one of his classmates had secretly brought a plastic frog into class the day before, and the teacher had screamed, and then the teacher herself had started laughing so hard and for so long that she couldn't continue the lesson. Delaney laughed out loud. She set the plate of eggs in front of him, rubbed the top of his head, and said she hoped he wasn't the one who had brought the frog into the classroom. Owen shook his head violently, his mouth full of toast, and insisted that he'd only been the one who knew about it beforehand. That moment, the little kitchen under its yellow light, the smell of fried eggs, the laughter of an 8-year-old boy, the sound of a bent fork touching a china plate, that moment was the most valuable thing Delaney Hart owned in the world. She would remember it for a very long time afterward, though she didn't yet know why. While Owen ate, she took the printed menu for that night's event from her bag and fixed it to the refrigerator door with a strawberry-shaped magnet. The page listed every course, every service window, every uniform requirement. She put it there out of habit, so she wouldn't forget, so she could read it one more time before leaving, and when she stepped back half a pace, she saw it hanging right beside the calendar, right beside the date circled in red ink. She looked at the 2 sheets of paper for several seconds, then she turned away and poured herself coffee. Her phone vibrated while she was rinsing the skillet. The woman on the other end was her caseworker, with a polite, hurried voice, the voice of someone reading from a screen while talking. She reminded Delaney that the hearing was coming up, that the court needed to see 2 things, proof of stable employment and proof of stable housing, and that if Delaney could send over verification of her income ahead of time, everything would go more smoothly. Delaney stood with her back against the sink, one hand still wet, and said, "Yes, I have that." She said it in the calm voice of someone telling the truth. The woman thanked her and hung up. Delaney remained where she was for a little while longer. She had a job, yes, but it was seasonal contract work, on call when they needed her and non-existent when they didn't. She had a place to live, yes, but the lease had expired back in the summer, and the landlord had simply continued letting her stay month to month, an act of kindness he could take back at any time with a notice taped to the door. She knew she had just lied. She knew it very clearly. But she also knew that if she told the truth that morning, everything would begin falling in a direction she wouldn't be able to stop. So she slipped the phone back into her pocket and went to get her brother's coat. Outside, the air was cool, that late autumn Chicago cold, the kind that hadn't started biting into the skin yet but was already enough to make people walk a little faster. The two of them walked 15 minutes to school. Owen kept talking about the frog, adding several details Delaney was fairly sure he had just invented. At the gate, she bent down and pulled his zipper all the way up to his chin, then told him to wait in the library that afternoon, because she would have someone pick him up early, since she had to work late that night. Owen nodded, turned, and ran toward the schoolyard, then suddenly stopped halfway across, looked back, and waved as hard as he could. Delaney waved back. She stood there until he disappeared through the doors. Then she turned up the collar of her coat, turned away, and started walking toward the bus stop that would take her to Michigan Avenue. By early evening, the ballroom at the Ashford Hotel was full, and Delaney had already been on her feet for 6 straight hours. She was assigned to the East section, which meant she was responsible for the row of tables near the wall hung with black and white photographs of the city from the days when streetcars still ran, and it also meant she could lean one shoulder against that wall for 3 seconds whenever the tray in her hands was empty. Those 3 seconds mattered more than most people would ever imagine. She counted down in her head, not by the hour but by service rounds. 2 more wine rounds, 1 dessert round, 1 clearing round, and then she could get out of there. Then she could catch the last bus. Then she could get back to the apartment and sit down on the sofa and not have to stand for 1 more second. The man came in after the event had already been underway for quite some time. Delaney noticed him before she noticed the room's reaction, and it was that reaction that made her stop. He didn't present an invitation. He didn't pause at the reception table where 2 young women were checking names against the guest list. He simply walked straight past them, slowly, empty-handed, carrying nothing at all, and no one stopped him. The hotel manager, a man with salt and pepper hair whom Delaney had seen berate an employee over a spoon set slightly out of place, left his post and crossed the ballroom with a speed she had never seen from him before. But he wasn't going over to stop the man. He went to the head table, bent down and said something to 2 guests seated there, and both of them stood up. Neither objected. One of them even nodded as though he had just been reminded of something he should have remembered on his own. The manager pulled out the chair himself, adjusted the silverware with his own hands, then stepped back half a pace and stood there waiting. The man sat down. He didn't shake anyone's hand. He didn't say thank you. He didn't look at the manager even once. Behind his chair, a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat remained standing. He didn't sit, didn't eat, didn't speak to anyone. He simply stood there in the way people stood when they knew exactly what their job was. Delaney had worked in service long enough to read a room simply by noticing where it went quiet, and that room had just gone quiet precisely where the man was sitting. The surrounding tables kept talking, kept laughing, but the volume dropped by half a degree, and no one turned their head in that direction for more than a second. She saw a man at the next table quietly change seats so his back wouldn't be facing the head table. She saw a young woman raising her phone to take a picture, suddenly lower her hand and put the phone back into her purse. No one explained anything to Delaney, and she didn't ask, but she understood that the man who had just entered wasn't missing from the guest list because the organizers had forgotten him. There were simply some names people didn't put on paper. He sat with his back straight, one hand resting on the table, and he didn't look at the stage, didn't look at the band, didn't look at the people who started toward him and then changed their minds before they got close. His eyes were fixed on the large projection screen positioned to the left of the stage, where a 3-dimensional rendering showed a future hotel complex, towers of glass rising along the water, new roads, rows of trees drawn into places where there was currently nothing but concrete and construction cranes. The text running beneath the rendering identified the property as the North Harbor waterfront parcel. He stared at that screen for a long time, longer than anyone else in the room, including the people who had paid for the project shown on it to exist. Then the lights shifted toward the stage, and the woman hosting the evening stepped forward. About 15 minutes earlier, Delaney had already had the chance to observe that woman from closer range than she would have preferred. Camille Ashford had been standing at the head table, holding a bottle of wine that a server had just opened. She turned it in her hand, gave it back, and said the label needed to face outward while the wine was being poured, because there were things that seemed small, but revealed everything about how a place was run. The server apologized and carried the bottle away. A few minutes later, Camille stopped in front of a flower arrangement on a side table, pulled out 3 stems, and placed them back differently, right in front of the woman who had just finished arranging them and was still standing there with the scissors in her hand. Then Camille snapped her fingers. She didn't call a name, didn't turn her head, simply snapped twice into the air, and a server 4 steps away had to abandon what he was doing and hurry over. Delaney saw all 3 things happen in less than 10 minutes, and she remembered them the way people remembered the location of a slick patch of water on a kitchen floor. Now, on stage beneath the lights, Camille Ashford said that a city was only truly great when it bent down to lift up the least fortunate among its people, and that tonight, everyone in that room was coming together to do exactly that. 400 people applauded. Delaney stood close to the wall with the tray balanced in both hands, counting down the service rounds she still had left. The applause gradually faded, and the room returned to the sounds of silverware against china, laughter, glasses touching glasses, and Delaney went back to her row of tables. She poured water, cleared appetizer plates, replaced napkins, and as she passed the head table for the 3rd time that evening, she saw something she would think about many times afterward. A white dinner napkin slipped from the edge of the table and fell to the floor beside the foot of the man seated at the head. The server standing nearby, a young man Delaney had only met during this shift, immediately bent down with the hurried movement of someone afraid of being seen as the person who had allowed it to fall. But the man bent down first. He picked up the napkin with 2 fingers, brushed it lightly, and handed it back to the young server. Then he read the name printed on the badge pinned to the young man's chest. He said it clearly, without rushing, and told him that the napkin wasn't his fault. The young man froze for a second, then stammered a thank you, and moved on. The entire exchange lasted less than 4 breaths. No one at the head table turned to look. No one at the nearby tables noticed. Of the 400 people inside the Ashford ballroom that night, Delaney Hart was the only one who saw it, and she stopped for half a step, still holding the water pitcher, trying to fit 2 things together in her mind. A room filled with hundreds of wealthy people didn't dare turn their heads and look directly at him, and he was the only person in that room who had bothered to read a waiter's name. She didn't understand it, and she didn't have time to understand it, because the kitchen was already calling for the main course service. It happened while she was carrying her 2nd tray. The silver tray in her hands held 4 plates, and 4 plates of entrees were heavier than most people imagined, heavy enough that you had to walk with a particular kind of step, heel first, shoulders straight, eyes on the path ahead instead of on the tray. She moved along the aisle between 2 rows of tables, an aisle that had grown narrower because someone had pulled a chair out and was sitting at an angle, and she was calculating in her head how to turn her body and slip past, when the man seated at the table to her right burst out laughing at something someone had just said and pushed his chair backward. He didn't look behind him. He had no reason to look behind him. The back of the chair struck Delaney's hip at the exact moment her weight was balanced over one leg. The tray jumped from her hands. She tried. That was what she remembered most clearly, that she had tried, that she had reached out to catch the edge of the tray, and her fingers had touched the cold metal for a fraction of a second before everything broke away from her. 4 china plates crashed onto the stone floor and shattered with a sound no band could have drowned out. The laughter at the nearest tables died instantly. Someone gasped. Someone shoved back a chair and stood. And the dark brown sauce, the sauce the kitchen had spent the entire afternoon simmering, splashed in a long streak across the floor, over the toes of a pair of shoes, and onto the hem of the dress worn by the woman who had just risen from the head table to walk toward the stage. Camille Ashford stopped in the middle of the aisle. She looked down at her feet. Then she looked up. Delaney was already down on one knee before she had time to think, because that was what her hands had been trained to do. She pulled the service cloth from her forearm, folded it in half, reached toward the stain, and said she was sorry. She said she was terribly sorry. She said she would clean it immediately, and would cover the cost of having the dress cleaned. Her voice was calm. She had done this before. Spilled wine, spilled coffee, spilled soup. Those were accidents that came with the profession. And the profession taught you that how you handled an accident mattered more than the accident itself. She leaned forward, and the cloth in her hand was still about a handspan from the toe of Camille's shoe. Camille Ashford kicked her foot forward. The kick wasn't aimed at Delaney. It was aimed at the cloth. The toe of her shoe knocked it from Delaney's fingers, sending it skidding across the stone floor until it disappeared somewhere beneath a table behind them. Delaney remained exactly where she was, one knee against the floor, one hand still extended into the air, her fingers still curled around the empty space where the cloth had been. She raised her head, and she saw that the woman standing in front of her was no longer looking at the stain. Camille was looking around the room, toward the nearest tables, toward the faces that had turned in their direction, measuring how many people were watching. Only then did Delaney understand that this wasn't going to end with a cloth. Camille Ashford didn't lower her voice. That was the first thing Delaney noticed. That this woman wasn't speaking to her so much as speaking through her. And the volume had been chosen with care, loud enough for the third table to hear every word, loud enough to make the fourth table turn around. She said she didn't need a towel. She said the entire room was full of towels, that what was missing here wasn't a towel. Then she said what was missing was a reminder, and that tonight she was going to give one, because clearly it had been far too long since anyone had bothered to remind this girl where her place was in this room. She continued without hurry, separating each word the way someone might read the terms of a contract, with your hands. Not a towel, not a rag, not water, with the same two hands that spilled it. And when you're finished wiping it up, bend down and kiss the toe of my shoe. There was a particular kind of silence that only appeared when a crowded room realized all at once that everyone had just heard exactly what they thought they had heard. The band in the corner stopped playing in the middle of a measure, not because anyone had signaled them to stop, but because the violinist looked up, and then all four musicians looked up with him. A glass was set down on a tabletop too quickly and made a dry, sharp sound. Somewhere behind them, a woman let out an audible breath, and then, one by one, phones began rising from the tables, not held high, not openly, simply tilted upright in people's palms in the way people did when they wanted to record something they knew they probably shouldn't be recording. Delaney stood up. She did it slowly, both arms hanging at her sides, and she stood there in the middle of the aisle with shards of china beneath her feet and a long streak of sauce across the stone floor. She could hear the blood moving in her ears. She could hear it with a strange clarity, more clearly than the voices around her. There was something she wanted to say. The sentence had already formed completely in her mind, that she wasn't the person who had pushed that chair backward, that 40 people in this room had seen the chair move, that if anyone was willing to ask, the truth was exactly one question away. The words were sitting right behind her teeth. She didn't say them, because in that moment, what appeared in Delaney Hart's mind wasn't truth, wasn't fairness, wasn't dignity. What she saw was the refrigerator door in the one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city. She saw the menu she had pinned there that morning with the strawberry-shaped magnet. She saw the calendar beside it, with the date circled in red ink, the date that was coming very soon. She heard the polite, hurried voice on the other end of the phone reminding her that the court needed to see two things: stable employment and stable housing. She heard her own voice, calm and certain, saying, "Yes, I have that." She had lied that morning. And if tonight she stood tall in this room, if she opened her mouth and told the truth about that chair, then by tomorrow morning that lie wouldn't be a small lie anymore. It would become something people wrote into a file. She thought of the hair standing straight up on one side of a little boy's head. She thought of the hand waving wildly at the school gate that morning, the wave of an 8-year-old child waiting for his sister to come pick him up that afternoon. Delaney Hart looked down at the stone floor, then she lowered herself. She did it by moving her left foot forward slowly, like someone stepping down a staircase in the dark without knowing how far away the next step was. Her right knee touched the floor first. The stone was colder than she had expected, the cold of something both hard and smooth, a cold that passed through the thin fabric immediately without needing time. Then her left knee came down. She heard a broken piece of china shift beneath her foot. She placed her right palm on the floor. The stone was wet there, wet and slick, and her fingers slid slightly before they found enough grip to stop. She lowered her head farther, and from that height the whole world narrowed until there was nothing left but a streak of dark brown sauce, fragments of white china, and the toes of a pair of shoes about 2 handspans from her hand. She heard someone stand up behind her. She didn't turn around. She reached her hand forward. The truth was, he had gotten to his feet long before that, the moment those words left Camille Ashford's mouth. Before the words "with your hands" had even had time to reach the fourth table, the man seated at the head of the main table had pushed back his chair and stood. But by then, there was a wall between him and the aisle. People had left their seats. They didn't rush forward. They simply shifted. One step, then another. the unconscious movement of a crowd when something worth watching was happening in the middle of it. And within only a few breaths, the aisle between the 2 rows of tables had been sealed off by people's backs, shoulders, and tilted heads trying to see past one another. He didn't shove anyone aside. He turned and went around the edge of the room, along the wall hung with black and white photographs, and it was a much longer way. On his first step, inside the circle of people, Delaney's right knee touched the stone floor. By his 4th step, then his 5th, her left knee had come down as well. He passed the reception table where the 2 young women stood pressed close together. Delaney's right palm came down against the wet floor, her fingers slipping slightly before finding their grip. He turned at the corner of the room, and the broad-shouldered man in the dark coat moved half a step ahead of him, parting a group of 3 people who were blocking the way without touching any of them, simply by stepping forward. Delaney lowered herself farther. She reached one hand out, and the distance between her fingertips and the streak of sauce on the toe of that shoe narrowed to 1 handspan, then half a handspan. The final step. A black leather shoe came down on the stone floor directly between her hand and the other pair of shoes. Delaney stopped. She saw it at eye level. The toe turned sideways, blocking her completely. And then she heard a voice above her head. The voice wasn't loud. It was low and even, no faster or slower than an ordinary sentence. And it consisted of only 2 words. Stand up. For 1 second, Delaney thought the words were meant for her. Then she realized he wasn't looking down. He was staring directly at the woman standing opposite him, and those 2 words were meant for her. Camille Ashford opened her mouth. She managed half a sentence about the dress, about what had just happened here, and then stopped, because he had asked his first question. He asked whether she had seen the tray fall. She said she had. He asked the second question, whether she had seen anything before the tray fell. Camille was silent. He asked the third question, and this time he spoke more slowly than he had before. He asked that if she hadn't seen it, why was she so certain? No one in the ballroom answered for her. He turned his head, not searching, not scanning the room, but looking directly at one particular table along the right-hand row, and he called the name of the man sitting there, first and last name. The man jerked to his feet as though he had been called on in a classroom. The man continued, still in that same even voice, saying that the chair this man had pushed backward, less than 5 minutes ago, had struck the hip of the girl now kneeling on the floor, that it had happened in the middle of an aisle where no chair should have been pushed into in the first place, and that if anyone in this room needed to be reminded of where he belonged, it wasn't the person kneeling on the floor. The man at the table on the right sank back into his chair. Camille Ashford said nothing more. The man bent down and held out his hand. It stopped in the air at Delaney's eye level, palm facing upward, and she looked at it for exactly 1 beat. Then she didn't take it. She pulled her wet hand from the floor, braced it against her knee, and pushed herself upright on her own. She stood with her back straight among the broken pieces of china. She apologized for the dinner, apologized for the noise, apologized for interrupting everyone's evening. She spoke to the entire room, not to anyone in particular. Then she bent down, picked up the silver tray, pressed it against her chest, and walked straight toward the side door reserved for employees, passing through the wall of people that opened on its own to let her through, without looking at anyone and without stopping. Behind her, 400 people remained perfectly still, and no one in the Ashford ballroom that night, not even the man who had just placed himself between her and those shoes, understood that he had just done the worst possible thing he could have done to Delaney Hart. The first call came before daylight had fully broken. The coordinator from the catering company spoke briefly and quickly, with the voice of someone who had prepared every word before dialing the number. He said the company was very sorry, that her seasonal contract was terminated effective today, and that the reason entered in her file was a serious workplace incident. Delaney asked which incident. He said he wasn't authorized to go into details. She asked whether anyone had reviewed what had actually happened. He said he was very sorry one more time and hung up. The second call came while she was still standing in the same place with the phone in her hand. The owner of the bakery where she worked the night shift 3 evenings a week said business had been slow lately, that she had to make cuts, and that she would call Delaney again when things improved. She said all of it in about 15 seconds, and didn't allow even a single second of silence to slip between her sentences, the way people spoke when they were afraid of being asked a question in return. The third call came about an hour later. The landlord didn't call. He sent a text message, and the message said he needed the apartment back by the end of the month, that he understood the notice was short, and that he was sorry. 3 things in one morning. Delaney sat down on the edge of the sofa and placed the phone face down on the cushion, and she remained there in silence for a long time. And while she sat there, she understood the whole thing. She understood that the woman in the Ashford ballroom the night before had been brought down in front of 400 people. She understood that the person who had brought her down was a man no one in that ballroom had dared look directly in the eye. A man whose name hadn't even been written on the guest list, and that Camille Ashford would never, not once, dare reach toward that man. But anger had to go somewhere. It always had to go somewhere. And in the entire story of the night before, there had been exactly one person Camille could reach. One person without a lawyer, without a name that carried weight, without anyone standing behind her. One person who could be erased from this city's payroll with 3 phone calls. Delaney sat on the edge of the sofa and realized that the man who had stepped between her and those shoes the night before was the reason her phone had rung 3 times that morning. She wasn't angry with him. She only felt something very cold rising inside her chest. The understanding that sometimes people saved you by pushing you out into the street. Then she looked at the clock on the wall and stood up, because today was Thursday, and this Thursday was Owen's birthday. She opened the kitchen cabinet and took out the bag of flour. There was about 2/3 of it left, enough for a small cake if she was careful and didn't ruin it even once. There were 2 eggs left, exactly the 2 eggs she had saved from the morning before according to that private kind of arithmetic she lived by. There was a little sugar left at the bottom of the container. A small piece of butter remained in the refrigerator, and there was no milk. But she knew a way to replace milk with water and add a little extra butter, a way her father had used during hard winters when she was a child. That afternoon, Owen came home, dropped his school bag on the floor, and stopped dead in the middle of the kitchen when he saw the large bowl and the bag of flour on the table. He asked if she was making a cake. Delaney said yes, and asked what kind of cake he thought suited someone who had just turned 8 years old. Owen answered immediately, without needing to think, that it had to be apple cake. Always apple cake. And there was nothing here to discuss. She said she had already guessed that, and she pulled a worn, leather-bound notebook from the drawer where she always kept it, their father's handwritten recipe book, filled with slanted handwriting and old stains on the pages. She opened it to the apple cake recipe and propped the notebook against the sugar container. Owen climbed onto a chair, rested his chin in his hands, watched her for a moment, then asked why she had been staying up so late lately, because every night when he got up for a drink of water, the kitchen light was still on. Delaney sliced the apples without looking up and said she was relearning some of Dad's recipes, that there were places where his handwriting was so bad she had to keep guessing what he had written, and that it was easier to figure things out at night when everything was quiet. Owen nodded, accepting the explanation with the solemn seriousness of an 8-year-old, then immediately asked if he could beat the eggs. She handed him the bowl and the fork, with one bent tine. He beat the eggs with all the strength in his body, beating them as though he were fighting them. An egg splattered onto his sleeve, across the table, and even into one side of his hair. Delaney burst out laughing. She truly laughed until she had to put the knife down. And when Owen saw his sister laughing, he beat the eggs even harder. And there in that little kitchen beneath the yellow light, surrounded by the smell of apples and melting butter, the 2 of them laughed together for a very long time. The cake came out of the oven a little burned on one side. Owen declared that was the best side. That same night, on the north side of the city, in the back room of a nightclub where music was still playing outside, a man had been sitting and waiting for 40 minutes. His name was Ray Mulvaney. He was 46 years old, and he had worked for the Belandi family since the days when he was still guarding warehouse doors. He sat in the only chair positioned in the middle of the room, and no one had told him he had to sit there, just as no one had told him he wasn't allowed to stand up. The door wasn't locked. That was the part that had soaked the back of his shirt with sweat. Raphael Belandi entered his own room without knocking. He took off his coat, draped it over the back of the chair opposite Ray, then sat down and placed a pale yellow envelope on the table, the kind of envelope people used for thick case files. He didn't speak first. Ray Mulvaney did, because when silence lasted long enough, people always spoke first. He said there had been a mistake in the books from the previous month, that he had meant to explain it the week before but had been busy, that the discrepancy came from an expense he had covered in advance for someone else. Raphael let him finish. He didn't interrupt him once. When Ray Mulvaney had said everything he had to say and there was nothing left to add, Raphael opened the envelope, removed a stack of papers, and spread them across the table in order, one sheet at a time. slowly, like a man laying out cards. Ray Mulvaney looked down, and the color changed in his face. They were all of his debts. Not debts to the Belandis. Debts outside the family. Bank debt, credit card debt, the mortgage he had missed, 4 payments on in a row. Money owed to a place no one wanted to owe money to, and where he had been in debt for nearly 2 years, and even one document he himself had forgotten he had ever signed. There were papers whose originals he had never seen. There were papers that, under ordinary circumstances, should have been sitting inside the safes of people who didn't know one another at all. And yet every one of them was here, on this table, arranged side by side, neat and complete, gathered by someone from 4 corners of the city, and brought into this exact room. Raphael looked at the papers instead of at him. He said he didn't care about the missing amount. He said the number was small, so small that if Ray Mulvaney had come to his door and asked for it, he probably would have been given the money. Then he said what he cared about was that for 4 straight months, this man had sat at the same table and eaten with him, had driven his car, had carried the keys to his warehouse, all while keeping something hidden in his pocket. Raphael's voice didn't rise by even a degree through any of it. That was what made Ray Mulvaney's hands begin to shake. In all the years he had worked for the Belandi family, he had heard plenty of men shout, and he knew how to survive being shouted at. What he didn't know how to survive was a man speaking to him in the same voice he would use to order dinner. Raphael gathered the papers into one neat stack. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out an old metal lighter, the kind with a flip top, and struck it. Ray Mulvaney started to rise from his chair, and Raphael merely looked at him once, and he sat back down. The flame caught the corner of the stack. Raphael held it in his hand until the fire had taken properly, then dropped the entire bundle into the large glass ashtray in the middle of the table. Paper burned faster than most people imagined. In the space of about a minute, everything Ray Mulvaney owed in this world, every number that had clung to him for the past 2 years, every signature he had put down on nights he didn't want to remember, all of it curled inward into black ash and glowing red embers. Firelight flickered across the faces of the 2 men sitting on opposite sides of the table. Neither of them spoke until the flames went out. Then Raphael snapped the lighter shut, and the sound of metal closing against metal was the loudest sound that room had heard all evening. He said that from now on, Ray Mulvaney didn't owe anyone anything. He said he did this once. Then he added exactly one more sentence. And he said it very softly. Softly enough to sound almost like goodnight. He said a man only got burned clean once, and that if there was ever a second time, no one would burn anything at all. There would be no envelope, there would be no room, and Ray Mulvaney would simply become someone whose name no one called anymore. Then Raphael stood, picked up his coat, and opened the door. Ray Mulvaney left the room about half a minute later. He walked down the hallway behind the bar, and 2 servers carrying tubs of ice had to step aside to let him pass, and both of them saw that the man kept one hand against the wall as he walked, taking each step in a short, careful distance, like someone who had just stepped off a ship that was still rocking beneath him. No one touched him. No one needed to. 2 days later, Delaney returned to the Ashford Hotel to collect her things. She had a canvas bag in one of the employee lockers, and inside it were a spare pair of shoes, a light jacket, a box of heel bandages, and a small photograph of her and Owen at the park the previous summer, which she had taped to the inside of the locker door. She entered through the side entrance reserved for employees, the same door she had walked out through that night, and no one stopped her, because no one had been told to stop her, because in the hotel's system she had never actually been a hotel employee. She had only worked for a catering company that had already removed her name from its payroll. She gathered her things quickly. She peeled the photograph away carefully so the tape wouldn't tear off a corner, closed the locker door, and on her way out she passed the auxiliary kitchen. It was a small kitchen at the end of the hallway, the place where food was reheated and coffee was made for the night staff. And at that hour the lights were still on, but no one was there. Except one man. He was sitting on a plastic chair beside a stainless steel table, his coat draped over the back of the chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, and there was nothing in front of him. No coffee, no phone, no papers. He was simply sitting there. Delaney stopped in the doorway. She had spent nearly 10 years standing in kitchens like this one, and she knew what a person looked like when he hadn't eaten all day. You didn't see it in the stomach. You saw it in the jaw, in the way the shoulders slumped forward, in the way someone sat when the body had already run empty but the mind still refused to stop. She stood there for about 3 seconds. Then she set her canvas bag on the floor, walked to the sink, and opened the cabinet. There was a package of dried noodles inside, the cheapest kind, the kind the kitchen bought by the case for the night staff. There were 2 eggs in a tray in the refrigerator. There was an onion and a clove of garlic someone had forgotten in a basket. She put a pot of water on the stove, sliced the onion, sautéed the garlic in a little oil at the bottom of the pot until it turned golden, then poured in the water, added the noodles, and cracked both eggs into the center of the pot before covering it for exactly 1 minute so the yolks would stay soft. She did all of it without saying a word, and he didn't ask what she was doing. She ladled everything into one of the kitchen's white porcelain bowls, scattered some chopped green onion over the top, and set the bowl on the stainless steel table in front of him with a fork and a spoon. She didn't tell him to eat. She didn't say it was a thank you, because it wasn't a thank you, and if she said those words, then both of them would have to remember that night, and she didn't want to remember that night. She simply set the bowl down, stepped back, and told him it was hot. Raphael Belandi looked at the bowl of noodles for several seconds. Then he picked up the spoon. He ate all of it, not quickly, not slowly, and without saying anything the entire time, and when the egg yolk broke open, he paused for half a beat before continuing. Delaney leaned against the sink with her arms folded across her chest, and she didn't say anything either. There was a kind of comfortable silence that could exist between 2 strangers in a kitchen at midnight, and she had forgotten that such a silence existed. When he finished eating, he set down the spoon, stood up, picked up the bowl and fork, carried them to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed them. He washed the inside and the outside, rinsed them again, then placed them upside down on the rack to dry. Delaney watched those 2 hands beneath the running water and said nothing. He picked up his coat, gave her a single nod, and left. The broad-shouldered man was waiting for him at the end of the hallway, out by the parking area, holding a thin file inside a plastic folder. Bruno handed it over without saying anything, because Bruno had worked for Raphael long enough to know when nothing should be said. Raphael stood beside the car and flipped it open. He skimmed the pages. Full name, date of birth, address of an apartment on the west side of the city, 1 younger brother, 8 years old, 1 case awaiting a court date, a vocational baking school, 2nd year, withdrawn before completion. Then farther down, in the section listing the places where she had worked, between a diner, a grocery store, and a coffee shop, there was 1 line that made his finger stop on the page. Sales clerk, flower stand outside the gates of North Chicago Cemetery. Raphael Belandi stood perfectly still beside the car for a long time. Then he closed the file, handed it back to Bruno, opened the car door, and got into the driver's seat himself. That night, he drove away alone. There are some places a person doesn't need a map to find, and that night, Raphael Belandi drove to the gates of North Chicago Cemetery the way a man drives back to an old home, making every turn he needed to make without having to think about it. He pulled over at the curb and sat still behind the wheel. And there in the darkness, one morning came back to him whole, intact down to the smallest detail, the morning he had tried not to think about for 7 years and had never once succeeded. It had been raining that day, the steady, lingering kind of Chicago rain that wasn't heavy and wasn't light, the kind that came near the end of the season, and the entire cemetery was nothing but mud, wet grass, and a grave that had already been dug. He had been out of prison for 3 days. 3 days. They had handed him a bag of personal belongings, a piece of paper, and the news about his younger brother, and he had received all 3 in the same afternoon. That morning, he stood beside the open grave with both arms hanging at his sides. There was no priest, because their family belonged to no church, and there was no one left to arrange one. There were no flowers, because no one had thought to buy any. There wasn't a single relative there. 2 gravediggers stood about 10 paces away, waiting with shovels in their hands, patient in the way of men who had waited like that hundreds of times before. There was a cheap wooden coffin that Raphael had been forced to sign an IOU to pay for, and inside it was Tobias Belandi, 19 years old. Raphael stood in the rain and didn't cry, because 7 years in a place like that had taught him that crying was a luxury a man paid for, and his body had forgotten how to do it. He simply stood there. Rainwater ran down inside the collar of his shirt. The 2 gravediggers glanced at each other. Then came the sound of footsteps across the wet grass. He looked up and saw a girl walking between the rows of graves toward him, very young, wearing one of those thin raincoats sold at gas stations, carrying a bouquet of white carnations in her hands. She walked straight to the grave, without asking who he was, without asking who was lying below. She bent down and placed the flowers on top of the coffin. Then she stepped back half a pace, stood beside him with both hands folded in front of her, and lowered her head slightly. And she stayed that way until it was over. She stayed while the two gravediggers lowered the ropes. She stayed while the first shovelfuls of earth struck the coffin, a sound no one ever heard, and then managed to forget. She stayed until the grave was filled and the earth had been patted flat, while the rain continued falling steadily across the shoulders of her thin raincoat, and through all of it, she didn't say a single word. When everything was finished, Raphael turned toward her. He took out his wallet. He didn't know what else to do, and in the world he had grown up in, that was what people did when someone gave them something. They paid, because paying meant you didn't owe, and not owing meant you were safe. He held out several bills and asked how much the flowers cost. The girl looked down at his hand. Then she shook her head. She said that today, he didn't have to pay for anything. He kept his hand extended, and she added one more sentence, a sentence he would carry with him for the next 7 years without ever understanding why. She said no one should have to stand alone. Then she pulled up the hood of her raincoat and turned away. He opened his mouth to ask her name, but she was already several steps away, and he was a man who had just gotten out of prison, standing in the middle of a cemetery with several wet bills still clutched in his hand, and there was something lodged in his throat that refused to become sound. She disappeared behind the line of trees near the gate. Raphael Belandi remained alone beside his brother's new grave, standing in the rain with a bouquet of white carnations he didn't know who had paid for. Dawn had only just begun to break when Raphael walked inside. He found the grave without stopping at the map near the entrance, and when he reached it, he stopped several steps away, because there was a bouquet of white carnations resting on the headstone. The flowers were still fresh. The petals were firm, the stems still damp, the kind of flowers that had been placed there within the past 2 or 3 days. He called Bruno over. Bruno looked at the bouquet, then shook his head. It wasn't him. It had never been him. Raphael stood there a little longer, then turned and walked back toward the gate. The flower stand was still in the same place, a green sheet metal roof set close against the fence, and the woman working there now was much older than the woman in his memory. She looked at him, then at the car parked outside, then back at him again, and she didn't ask a single question. He gave her the name on the grave. She went inside, pulled out a plastic box filled with ledgers, flipped through several of them, then opened a worn hardback book with frayed corners and ran one finger down the page. She stopped at a line and turned the book toward him. The handwriting there was small, written in ballpoint pen, blurred slightly by time. She said there had been a girl working there back then, working mornings before going to school for afternoon classes. She said that before the girl left the job, she had paid money in advance, and that the amount had been her entire final month's wages, without keeping a single dollar for herself. She said the girl had asked them to place one bouquet on that grave every week, and she hadn't explained why, and the woman hadn't asked. Raphael looked down at the line of handwriting. He asked how long the money had covered the flowers. The woman who owned the stand shrugged and said the money had run out a very long time ago, that she had simply kept doing it because it had become part of her Tuesday morning routine, and that if he wanted to know, she paid for the flowers herself now. Then she added one more thing, something she considered hardly worth mentioning. She said the girl had applied to work there because her father was buried inside the cemetery, several rows away from that grave, and working at the flower stand meant she could visit him every morning. Raphael Belandi stood motionless in front of the stand for a long time. He thanked her, paid for the next 20 bouquets, and walked back to the car. Bruno opened the car door for him, but Raphael didn't get in right away. He stood there with one hand resting on the roof of the car, his eyes fixed on the line of trees inside the cemetery, and Bruno had worked for him long enough to know that now it was all right to speak. Bruno said there was something he had kept thinking about ever since that night. He said the reason his boss had gone to the Ashford ballroom that evening wasn't the charity event. And it wasn't because anyone had invited him. It was because the waterfront property was shown on that projection screen, and because his boss wanted to see with his own eyes who was trying to buy it. Then Bruno said the rest more slowly. He said that if that projection screen hadn't been there that night, his boss wouldn't have been in that room. And if his boss hadn't been in that room, then that night there wouldn't have been a single person there to help that girl back onto her feet. Bruno's words stayed with Raphael all the way back, and by the next morning they had turned into an entirely different question. Not why he had been at the Ashford ballroom, but why someone wanted to buy the waterfront property, and why the thought of it unsettled him so much. The North Harbor parcel was the last thing left that still carried his father's name. It hadn't made a profit in years, but it was still there, and as long as it remained there, there was still one place on the map of this city that he could point to. Raphael ordered the records storage room opened. It was in the basement of the old transportation company office building, a long room lined with metal shelving and filled with the smell of damp paper that had settled into layers over the years. 3 of Bruno's men worked down there for 2 full days, pulling out box after box, brushing off the dust, reading the labels on the spines, and sorting everything again by year. Raphael went down there on the afternoon of the second day. He wasn't looking for anything specific. That was what mattered. He only wanted to know how that piece of land had lived during the 7 years he had been gone. Who had signed what? Where the money had come in? Where it had gone out? Because some instinct inside him had begun to stir, and he still didn't have a name for it. Bruno handed him a file box with a label bearing 2 words: incident reports. There wasn't much inside. A few forklift collisions, a small fire in warehouse number 3, a noise complaint filed by residents across the road that had been settled, and at the very bottom, a thin file containing only 4 sheets of paper. 4 sheets. Raphael read the first one. It was the report of a fatal workplace accident that had occurred in the Eastern Crane area. The section describing the cause was written in exactly 2 sentences, and those 2 sentences stated that the accident had been caused by careless operation on the part of the worker and failure to follow established safety procedures. The conclusion on responsibility stated that the fault lay entirely with the employee. The compensation section contained 1 word: no. The case status stated that the matter had been closed, not referred to the authorities, and that no further investigation had been recommended. The second page was a witness statement, and that statement was exactly 5 lines long. The third page was an equipment inspection report completed after the accident, and the column recording the condition of the equipment had been left blank. It didn't say normal. It was blank. The 4th page was the approval sheet. Raphael had worked with records long enough to know that a file containing only 4 pages wasn't a complete file. It was what remained of a file after pieces had been removed. He turned back to the first page and read it a second time, more slowly. A man had died on his family's waterfront property. There had been no investigation, no compensation, not a single line showing that anyone had asked even 1 question. A human being had died there, and everything that remained of that death was 4 sheets of paper sitting at the bottom of a box in a basement. He asked Bruno when it had happened. Bruno looked at the date printed in the corner of the report and gave him the time period, and both men fell silent, because that period fit entirely within the 7 years Raphael had been gone. Then he turned to the final sheet, the approval page. At the bottom, beneath the printed line identifying the person authorized to issue the conclusion, there was a signature. It had been written in blue ink, the first stroke rising high before sweeping downward into a broad loop, and Raphael Belandi had seen that signature on his family's dining table since before he had even learned to read. He set the paper down on the metal table. He said nothing for a very long time. Bruno stood beside him and didn't dare ask. The man who had signed that page was his father's younger brother, the man who had taught him how to drive, the man who had taken over the entire waterfront operation during the years Raphael had been inside, the only person in the family who had still come to visit him during those final winters, and the man who, on the day Raphael walked out through the prison gates, had come to pick him up in that same old car. Raphael folded the 4 sheets of paper and slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat. That same morning, on the west side of the city, Delaney Hart was folding cardboard boxes on the living room floor. She had managed to get 6 boxes from the grocery store down the street and a roll of packing tape. And she started with the kitchen drawer, because she knew that if she began anywhere else, she would end up sitting down. The first thing she placed into the first box wasn't dishes, wasn't clothing, wasn't paperwork. It was her father's worn leather-bound notebook. She took it out of the drawer, brushed the cover with her palm, wrapped it in a cotton towel, and placed it at the bottom of the box, tucked into the corner, the safest place she could find. Only then did she begin stacking everything else on top. Some families measured what they owned by the things that had value. Other families measured it by the things no one could buy. That afternoon, Owen came home and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw the boxes, and Delaney had been preparing herself for that moment for hours. She crouched down until she was level with his eyes, and told him the 2 of them were about to have an adventure. She said they were going to stay with Marlowe for a while, and Marlowe had a balcony that looked straight out over the train tracks, which meant they could sit there at night and count the trains as they passed. Owen asked if freight trains counted too. She said of course they did. Freight trains were even more worth counting because they were longer. He immediately announced that he was going to keep a record, that he needed a separate notebook just for this, and that he had to bring his stuffed dog because it had never seen a train before. Then he ran into the bedroom and began packing his own things, the way an 8-year-old packed, which meant stuffing everything into one backpack and then sitting on top of it so he could pull the zipper closed. Delaney stood in the doorway watching her little brother wrestle with the zipper and smiled, and he never turned around, so he didn't see his sister lift the back of her hand and wipe it across her eyes. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, Bruno called. He had followed the 5-line witness statement in the 4-page file and found a detail the person who had written the report probably hadn't noticed. On the list of people present at the scene that day was the name of a shift foreman, and according to the old waterfront personnel records, that foreman had left his job only a few weeks after the accident. He had left completely. He hadn't transferred to another department, and his contract hadn't simply ended. But that wasn't the most important part. The most important part was on another sheet Bruno had dug out of a personnel records box, an internal memorandum stating that an objection had been raised against the conclusion in the accident report, and the person who had raised that objection was the same man. His name was Walt Prosser. He was the only person in that entire system who had opened his mouth. Raphael and Bruno drove to the address listed in the file late that afternoon. It was a single-story house in a southwestern suburb, with a peeling white wooden fence, a maple tree in the front yard, and grass growing higher than a person's knees. Raphael got out of the car and stood at the entrance to the walkway for a moment before moving forward. The front steps were covered in a thick layer of rotting leaves. There was a pile of mail in front of the door. Not a few pieces. A pile. The old envelopes at the bottom had turned yellow and stuck together from the rain. Advertising flyers had dried against the concrete, and on top were several free newspapers, still bound with their original bands. The mailbox mounted beside the door was so full that the lid wouldn't close. Bruno knocked. No one answered. He knocked again, then tried the handle. The door was locked. Raphael walked around to the back and looked through the kitchen window. Inside, the late afternoon light was strong enough to reveal a fine layer of dust lying evenly across the table, the counter, and the kettle that was still sitting on the gas stove. There was one cup in the sink. A calendar hung on the wall, stopped on a month that had long since passed. There were no signs that anyone had searched the place. Nothing had been broken. The house didn't look like somewhere people had broken into. It looked like a place whose owner had walked out the door and never come back. The neighbor next door, an elderly woman watering potted plants on her porch, said she didn't remember very clearly. She said Mr. Prosser had lived alone, didn't talk much, and usually worked in his yard in the mornings, and then one day she simply stopped seeing him. She said people had come around asking questions, that the electric company had sent a truck to shut off the power, that someone had taped notices to the door, and then later taken them down. Raphael asked how long ago that had been. The old woman set down her watering can and thought for a long time, then gave him a number. And Bruno turned to look at Raphael, because the number wasn't measured in months. The only man who had ever objected to that report had disappeared from this house almost immediately after signing his objection, and no one had seen him for all those years. They reached the office after dark. Raphael sat down at the desk, switched on the lamp, and took the 4 sheets of paper, folded in half, from the inside pocket of his coat. He smoothed them flat across the desktop. He had read the first page twice in the basement, but both times he had focused on the cause, the conclusion, the compensation, the case status, and he had read those sections like a man trying to find what had been hidden. Neither time had he read the first section. The first section was the part people's eyes passed over, because it was only procedure, a pre-printed rectangular box in the upper left corner containing the information of the worker involved, full name, year of birth, employee identification number, department. Now he read it. The name inside that box had been typed in ink faded by the years. Errol Hart. Raphael sat completely still. He read it again, one letter at a time, as though there were some chance he had seen it wrong, as though looking more carefully might turn it into another name. Then he reached to his left and pulled over the thin file inside the plastic folder Bruno had handed him in the hotel parking lot, the file he had skimmed through that night, and returned immediately after his finger stopped on the line about the flower stand. He opened it. First page, first line, Delaney Hart. He turned to the family information section. Father. Deceased. The date of death was listed there, and it matched the date printed in the corner of the accident report lying less than a handspan away on the same desk. Raphael placed the 2 pages beside each other. He didn't stand up. He didn't say anything. Bruno stood on the other side of the room and watched his boss remain motionless for so long that he himself began to feel short of breath. And throughout all that time, the only thing moving in the room was Raphael's thumb, rubbing back and forth along the edge of the paper until the corner curled upward. The girl who had crossed the wet grass in the rain to place a bouquet of white carnations on his brother's coffin. The girl who had stood beside him until the grave was filled. The girl who had refused his money and told him that no one should have to stand alone. That girl had been at the cemetery that morning because her father was buried only a few rows away. And her father was buried there because he had died on a waterfront property bearing the Belandi family name. And that death had been closed with 4 sheets of paper, 1 blank column, 1 word, no, and a signature Raphael had known since before he could read. Raphael stood up. He gathered Delaney's file and the 4 pages of the accident report, stacked them together into one pile. And he didn't put them in a drawer, didn't hand them to Bruno for safekeeping, didn't lock them in a safe. He carried the entire stack straight out to the car. Bruno asked where his boss was going. Raphael didn't answer. He opened the car door, placed the papers on the passenger seat, and drove north, toward the neighborhood where the man who had taught him how to drive was living. That afternoon, Owen was at a classmate's house after school, and Delaney returned to the apartment alone to move the last few boxes. She saw the door before she even reached the top of the stairs. It was hanging open by about a handspan, and the wooden frame around the lock had split, exposing a pale streak of raw wood. She stood on the final step for a long time. Then she pushed the door open. Inside, all 6 cardboard boxes she had carefully sealed with tape had been sliced across the top, their lids torn open, their contents spilled onto the floor. Clothes were scattered throughout the living room. The dishes had been taken out of their box and stacked beside the leg of the table, not one of them broken, because whoever had done this hadn't come to destroy anything. Whoever had done this had been looking for something. The kitchen drawers had been pulled all the way out and left that way. The refrigerator stood wide open, with the menu and the calendar still attached to the door. The tin box where she kept her cash was still on top of the cabinet, its lid open, and every dollar inside was still there. Several $20 bills and a stack of smaller ones she had counted twice the night before. Owen's old tablet lay on the sofa, its screen already cracked since the year before, untouched. Delaney walked through every room. She moved slowly, didn't call anyone, didn't touch anything. Then she returned to the first box. It was lying on its side beside the window. The cotton towel she had used for wrapping had been pulled out and thrown aside, unfolded and crumpled. She picked it up and shook it once. Nothing fell out. She turned the box upside down and emptied everything onto the floor. She did the same with the other 5 boxes. She pulled every piece of clothing from the closet. She dragged the sofa away from the wall and looked into the space behind it. She opened every kitchen drawer again. Not a single dollar was missing from that apartment. Not one electronic device. Not one thing that could have been sold. Only one thing was gone. Delaney sat down on the floor in the middle of all her belongings, both hands resting on her knees, and stared at the empty corner at the bottom of the first box, the corner she had chosen because it was the safest place, the corner where now there was nothing but a faint rectangular stain pressed into the cardboard, where a worn leather-bound notebook had rested for several days. She looked at it for a very long time. Then she stood up. She checked the clock and counted backward. 1 hour and 40 minutes remained before she had to pick up Owen. She started with the clothes. She folded each piece again, placed it back into the box, and stretched tape across the top to seal it. She gathered the dishes, wiped them clean, and packed them again. She closed every kitchen drawer. She pushed the sofa back into place. She picked up the tablet and set it neatly on the table. She took a broom and swept the floor, including the splinters of wood scattered beneath the door. Then she took the roll of tape and layered 3 strips over the cracked section of the doorframe, pressing them down with her palm until they lay flat and nothing could be seen from outside. She washed her hands, changed her shirt, and went downstairs to pick up her little brother. By the time Owen came home, darkness had already fallen. He ran inside, dropped his school bag on the floor, and asked what they were having for dinner. Raphael arrived at his uncle's house that evening, but the man wasn't there. The housekeeper said her employer had gone out and wouldn't be back until late. Raphael said he would wait in the study, and there wasn't a person in that house with the authority to tell Raphael Belandi which rooms he was or wasn't allowed to enter. The study was at the end of the first-floor hallway, behind a heavy wooden door, and inside stood a large desk with its back to the window. Raphael sat down in the chair opposite the desk and rested the stack of papers on his lap. He sat there for about 10 minutes. Then his eyes stopped on something lying on the desktop between a pile of correspondence and a pen tray. It was a small brown leather-bound notebook, its stitching split loose along the upper edge of the spine, all four corners worn smooth and rounded. It didn't belong in that room. Everything else on the desk belonged to a wealthy man, while that notebook looked like something that belonged in the kitchen drawer of a working family. Raphael stood and picked it up. He opened to the first page. The handwriting slanted across the paper in blue ballpoint ink, and at the top of the page were 3 words: yeast bread recipe, followed by a list of ingredients and measurements. The next page was butter cookies, then apple cake, then a page containing a recipe for potato soup, with a note written in the margin saying that if there was no milk, water could be used instead with an extra piece of butter added. Several pages bore round stains left by the bottoms of cups. There was a small scorch mark along the edge of one sheet, somewhere close to where a stove must once have been. One page had flour stuck to it that had dried hard long ago. Raphael began turning the pages more quickly. In the middle of the notebook, between 2 baking recipes, there was a page where the handwriting was still the same, but written much more hurriedly, and he stopped. Then he continued toward the final pages, and there, across 4 consecutive pages, the careful, slanted handwriting disappeared completely. In its place was the writing of a man taking notes while standing, perhaps using a pen clipped to his shirt pocket, the letters uneven in size. Some strokes pressed so hard they had torn through the paper. The first page contained a column of dates. Beside each date was an equipment identification code, made up of letters and numbers, and beside each code were a few brief words describing its condition. Some lines said the braking mechanism wasn't engaging. Others said the cable showed signs of fraying along the middle section. One line had been underlined twice. The second page listed the names of 3 people he had reported the problem to, along with the date of each report and whether he had made it verbally or in writing. Beside the first 2 names were the words, "No response." Beside the third name, written more heavily, was a note saying that this person had promised to take care of it and had asked him not to tell anyone else. The third page was a rough hand-drawn diagram showing the location of the damaged component, with arrows pointing toward it and notes written beside them. And the fourth page, the last page containing any writing, had only 3 lines. The first line gave the name of a city labor inspection agency. The second contained a telephone number. The third recorded an appointment. Friday, 9 o'clock, bring copies. Raphael looked at the date written at the top of that page. Then he took the accident report from his stack of papers and placed it beside the notebook. The man had died on Wednesday of that same week. Raphael stood inside his uncle's study, holding the leather-bound notebook in one hand and the report bearing that familiar signature at the bottom in the other, and he understood the entire shape of what had happened. A worker had seen that the equipment was defective. He had reported it 3 times, to 3 different people. No one had done anything. The third man had told him to keep quiet. He hadn't kept quiet. He had written everything down in the one thing he always carried with him, the one thing no one would ever think to search, the thing tucked between recipes for bread and apple cake, and he had made an appointment to take copies to an inspector on Friday morning. He hadn't lived to see Friday. Then 4 pages had been prepared. 1 column had been left blank. 1 word, no, had been entered in the compensation box. 1 signature had been placed at the bottom of the final page, and his death had been closed away. Raphael turned backward through the notebook, several pages, until he reached the apple cake recipe. The edge of that page had been worn smooth and curled slightly upward, the kind of wear that came from a sheet of paper being turned over and over again for many years. In the lower corner was a patch of dried flour. He looked at that page, then at the final 4 pages, and what appeared in his mind at that moment wasn't his uncle. It was the image of a girl standing in some small kitchen, propping this notebook against a sugar container, running one finger down the list of ingredients, reading her father's handwriting so she could make an apple cake for her little brother. 3 years. For 3 years she had held in her hands the thing that revealed who had killed her father, and she had opened it hundreds of times only to read the recipes. Raphael Belandi closed the notebook and carried it out of that house without waiting another minute. Delaney didn't have much trouble finding the address. She asked 2 people, and the second, a woman working at a shop on a corner on the north side, gave her directions by naming the building, and immediately turned back to what she had been doing, without asking why Delaney wanted to go there. She went for one very simple reason. After the night someone had torn through her apartment, after sitting on the floor and staring at the rectangular stain at the bottom of the cardboard box, she had lain awake until nearly dawn, and sometime before morning she realized that in her entire life, only one person had stepped into it and changed everything. And every terrible thing had begun that night. She wasn't going to find him so she could blame him. She was going to ask him what was happening to her life. The building stood at the end of a short street, with a red brick front and a frosted glass door with no sign on it. The front door was slightly open. She pushed it inward and found herself standing at the beginning of a long hallway with a low ceiling and yellow lights, and she had taken only 3 steps when she heard a door open at the far end. She stepped backward into the recess of a doorway and stood still. Raphael Belandi came out of the room at the end of the hall with his coat in one hand, and he began walking toward her. 4 men were positioned along the hallway, 2 leaning against the wall and talking, one sitting on the edge of a table, another holding a phone to his ear. Delaney watched what happened next, move down the corridor like a wave. The man with the phone lowered it in the middle of a sentence and slipped it into his pocket. The man sitting on the edge of the table came down onto his feet and stood straight. The 2 men leaning against the wall pushed themselves away from it, and then all 4 of them, without anyone telling them to, not quite at the same moment but within less than 2 seconds, lowered their heads. It wasn't a nod of greeting. They bowed their heads, chins toward their chests, eyes on the floor, and they remained that way the entire time he walked past them. Raphael passed between them. He didn't stop. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't look at a single one of those 4 men, didn't glance at them, didn't nod, didn't give any sign at all that he knew they existed. He passed them exactly the way a person passed a row of pillars. Only after he had gone by did the 4 men lift their heads and return to what they had been doing. Delaney stepped out of the doorway. Raphael stopped. There was one very brief moment when his face changed, and it was the only time that night it did. He said her name. She didn't answer. She stood there with the canvas bag held against her stomach and asked him one question. She asked what the difference was between the woman in the Ashford ballroom that night, the woman who had forced her to kneel in front of 400 people, and the man who had just walked down this hallway and made 4 grown men lower their faces toward the floor without even having to look at them once. She asked it very calmly. She didn't raise her voice, didn't tremble, and she didn't wait for him to deny it. Raphael Belandi opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. He stood in the middle of the hallway with his coat draped over one arm, and he couldn't say a single word. He was the man. 400 people in a room had been afraid to look directly in the eye. The man who could make a corporation disappear from the city map with a single phone call, and he stood there silent before a 27-year-old woman holding a canvas bag because he was a man who never lied, and in that moment, he couldn't find a single truthful thing to say. The silence lasted long enough to become an answer. Delaney gave one very slight nod, the way someone did after confirming something she had already suspected. Then she said she had a hearing the following week. She said she would go alone. She said she didn't need anyone to speak for her, didn't need anyone to call anyone, didn't need any name mentioned there, because she had already seen what happened to places where his name was mentioned. Then she turned away. She had taken several steps when he spoke behind her. He said that no one should have to stand alone. Delaney stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood there for about 3 seconds. And then she said, very softly, that those were her words. Then she walked out the door. Raphael didn't stop her. Warehouse 3 stood on the eastern edge of the waterfront, and it still smelled of machine oil even though it had held nothing for years. Raphael got there first. He switched on a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, dragged 2 folding chairs out to the middle of the concrete floor, and set 3 things on the wooden crate between them. 4 accident reports, the leather-bound notebook, the file on Delaney Hart. Aldo Belandi arrived about half an hour later. He was 68 years old, walked with a slight limp in his left leg ever since he was young, and he stepped into the warehouse without pausing at the door. He looked at the table, looked at the 3 things laid out on it, and then sat down in the empty chair. He didn't ask why he had been called there. Raphael asked only one question. He asked why. Aldo was silent for a long time. both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. Then he began to speak, and his voice was so calm it sounded like he was telling someone else's story. He said that when the incident happened, the entire waterfront was under watch. He said that if a death had been reported to the authorities, inspectors would have come down, and if inspectors had come down, they would not have stopped at the crane. He said that back then warehouses number 4 and number 5 were holding things that, if opened, would not have led to fines, but to federal charges, and it would not have been one man going to prison, but 20, and the Belandi name would have been erased from this waterfront forever. He said he had sat in front of that report all night. Then he signed it. Raphael asked how much it had cost. Aldo gave him a number. He said the money had been divided into 4 parts, and he named the 4 places it had gone, speaking as plainly as a man who had repeated the same answer to himself many times over many years. Raphael sat in silence and listened to all of it. Then he said that he didn't understand one thing. He said that 7 years earlier, he himself had taken the blame for his father, had served the full 7 years, so his father wouldn't have to die in there. He said that if the waterfront had been clean after he went to prison, then why was there still something to hide by then? Aldo Belandi lifted his head. He looked at his nephew for a moment. Then he asked whether he thought he had gone to prison because of his father. Raphael didn't answer. Aldo said that yes, his father was sick, but that sentence had not been his father's. He said that sentence belonged to the whole waterfront, and that they needed a name, and the cheapest name was a 27-year-old boy who had nothing to lose yet. He said that he was the one sitting in that room, with 3 other men, when that name was chosen. There was no sound in the warehouse except the faint buzz of the light overhead. Raphael stood up. He kicked the folding chair backward, and it hit the concrete with a sharp crack, and he took 2 steps forward and stopped, both hands clenching and unclenching, and for the first time in his adult life, he spoke loudly, saying, 7 years, saying he had lost 7 years, saying his brother had died during those 7 years, and he hadn't even been there. Aldo didn't stand. He didn't back away. He stayed seated in the folding chair and let the anger pass over him. And when Raphael stopped to catch his breath, he went on with the rest. He said that the money, the largest part of the 4 parts, had not gone into anyone's pocket. It had gone into the hospital. It had paid for 3 rounds of Tobias's treatment, paid for the things insurance refused to cover, paid for a specialist brought in from elsewhere to consult. He said the boy had been very sick, that he had tried, that he had sat in that hospital corridor for many nights. Then he said the final line of that part in a much smaller voice. He said that in the end, the boy still didn't make it. Raphael Belandi stood in the middle of the warehouse and could no longer move. A human being had died on this waterfront, and that death had been traded for money, and that money had been used to save his brother, and his brother had still died. Both of them had been lost. 2 lives, and nothing had been saved. And all that remained were 4 pages in a box in a basement, and a 27-year-old woman moving out of her apartment on the west side of the city. Aldo bent down, picked up the fallen folding chair, and set it back upright. Then he sat down again and placed his hands on his knees as before. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not say he had done it for family. He simply sat there. And after a long while, he asked his nephew one question, and it was the only time that evening his voice cracked. He asked whether, in those final days, anyone had sat beside the boy. Raphael stepped out of the warehouse when dawn was nearly breaking. Bruno was waiting by the car parked out in the lot, and he didn't ask anything, only open the door. Raphael didn't get in. He took out his phone and stood there, looking out toward the water to the east, where the old crane stood in silhouette against the sky as it changed color. Then he made the call. Bruno heard the first 3 words and understood right away that his boss wasn't calling the family lawyer, wasn't calling anyone from the list of names a man like Raphael Belandi usually called when something happened. He gave his full name. He named someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, someone who 7 years earlier had sat on the other side of a table in a courtroom. He said he had documents related to a fatal workplace accident that had been closed improperly, that he had the original records, that he would hand them over, and that he would come in himself. There was a long silence on the other end before anyone answered. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When Raphael ended it and slipped the phone back into his pocket, Bruno was still standing there with his hand on the open car door. He knew exactly what he had just heard. Not an internal hit, Not one of the old-style purges the Belandi family still carried out, the kind everyone understood the rules of. This was a call to the federal government, made willingly, with the original documents in hand, which meant the waterfront would be sealed off, which meant the file would be reopened, and once a file had been reopened, no one could control where it stopped, which meant the people who had eaten at the same table with this family for 30 years would look at their boss differently starting tomorrow morning. Bruno opened his mouth to say something. Then he closed it, and only nodded, and shut the car door after Raphael got in. That same morning, on the other side of the city, someone rang the apartment where Delaney and Owen were staying. Delaney opened the door, and it took her a moment to recognize the person standing in the hallway. Camille Ashford wasn't accompanied by an assistant. There was no car parked below. She was wearing flat shoes, carrying a briefcase, and she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Delaney didn't invite her in. Camille didn't ask to come in. She stood in the hallway, opened the briefcase, and took out a bound report about an inch thick. She said it was the risk assessment prepared by her company's legal department for the planned purchase of the North Harbor property. She said this was the complete version, not the summary given to the board. Then she turned to a page marked with a paper note and handed the entire folder to Delaney. On that page, in the section listing unresolved legal risks tied to the property, there was one line numbered like all the others. It stated that there had been a fatal accident that had not been fully investigated, that the case had been closed too early, and that there was a possibility it could be reopened. Below that, in the notes section, the legal team had listed the people who could become witnesses if the matter were revived. There were 3 names. The first 2 had been crossed out, with a note saying their whereabouts could not be confirmed. The third name was not crossed out. Beside it was an address in a small town in Wisconsin, along with a recent update date, Walt Prosser. Delaney looked up. She asked why. Camille Ashford didn't answer the question the way people usually answered questions. She said that if this folder left her hands, the waterfront deal would die within 48 hours, that the board would suspend her before the end of the week, and that this was the deal she had pursued for 4 years, and the only thing that still let people call her Ashford in the sense she wanted. She said all of that in the flat voice of someone reading a balance sheet. Then she added that the video clip from the ballroom that night had spread across the city, that she had watched it, and that what kept her awake wasn't what people were saying in the comments below it. She didn't say what it was. She didn't apologize. She didn't say a single word with forgiveness in it. She simply closed the briefcase, said that the original copy of this folder had been sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office that morning, then turned and went back down the stairs. Delaney stood at the door with the file in her hands, and from inside the apartment came Owen calling for his sister to come look at a freight train that was very long and moving past outside. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a small courtroom on the 4th floor of the family court, the kind of room that had only 4 rows of benches and 1 tall window. Delaney arrived 40 minutes early. She was wearing the only shirt she still considered decent, her hair tied back neatly, and on the table in front of her she placed a stack of papers she had rearranged 3 times the night before. On the opposite side, the lawyer representing the agency handling her case raised 2 issues, and both of them were things she had already expected. The first was employment. The second was housing. The lawyer stated the matter briefly, without cruelty, simply as part of the job, that the current record did not show the stability required. Delaney stood and spoke for herself. She said she was staying with someone, yes, and she gave the address. She said she did not yet have a new job, yes. She did not make excuses. She only said that her younger brother had gone to school every single day for the past 3 years, that he had never missed a dental appointment, and that if the court needed to know what she could do, those were the things she could prove. Then she sat down. The judge was a woman with silver hair and thin framed glasses, and she did not ask anything further. She turned the file pages, and then she said that before going on, she wanted to read a document that had been mailed to her office the previous week. She said it was not part of the official file, and that she had considered whether to read it, but had decided to do so. She held up a sheet of graph paper torn from a notebook, its edges still ragged. Delaney recognized the handwriting from her seat and brought a hand to her mouth. The judge read it, and she read it word for word, keeping even the misspellings. The letter began with a greeting to the person in charge of making the decision, with "in charge" misspelled. Then it said the writer's name was Owen, that he was 8 years old, and that he was writing because he thought maybe people needed to know. Then it said that his sister made the best apple cake in the world, better than the bakery on the corner, and that the last time she made him a birthday cake, one side burned, but the burned side was the best side, and he ate that side first. Then it said that his sister knew how to replace milk with water and butter, because Dad had taught her, and Dad wrote it in a notebook, and his sister read that notebook at night, because nighttime was quiet and easier for guessing words. Then it said that his sister cooked better than anyone in the world, that he had already said that, but he wanted to say it again to make sure. At the end of the letter, he signed Owen Hart, with both words in capitals, and beneath it he had drawn a round cake with cross-hatched lines. No one in the courtroom spoke for a long time. The lawyer on the other side looked down at the papers in front of him. The judge set the letter down and removed her glasses to wipe them, very slowly. Then she put them back on, turned to a much thicker file, and said that the court had also received a substantial set of supplemental materials related to the applicant's family circumstances, specifically the death of the father, and that those materials were currently under review by the U.S. Attorney's Office. She asked who had submitted that portion. Delaney turned around. In the back row, near the door, an older man sat alone. He was wearing a faded cloth coat, both hands resting on a knit cap in his lap, and he had been sitting there before she entered the room without her noticing. He stood and gave his name. Walt Prosser. He said he had been a shift foreman at the North Harbor. He said he had signed an objection, and 3 weeks later he left his house in the night and never came back, not because anyone had forced him out, but because he had lain awake for many nights and convinced himself that men from the Belandi family would come for him. He said he had lived in a small town for all those years, worked in a sawmill, and told no one his real name. Then he said that a few days earlier, a woman had driven all the way out to find him, alone and unannounced, and she had shown him a paper with his name on it, and she had said she wasn't there to ask him to do anything. She was only there to tell him that Errol Hart's daughter was still living in this city. He said he had sat in his kitchen all night after that. Then the next morning, he took a bus down to Chicago. The judge made notes. She asked a few more procedural questions. Then she ruled. Delaney did not hear the first half of the sentence clearly. Only the part that said guardianship was granted. She signed the paper at the clerk's table with a hand shaking so badly that the first signature failed, and she had to sign a second time. When she stepped out into the hallway, a man was standing against the wall opposite the courtroom door. He carried nothing. He did not step forward. He looked at her, nodded once, and then turned and walked toward the stairs. Aldo Belandi was taken away on a Thursday afternoon, and he went without resisting, without a lawyer standing in the doorway, without a single word. 3 days later, Raphael called everyone who was left back into the room behind the nightclub. He spoke briefly. He said the waterfront would be sealed, that the file was now in federal hands, that he himself had taken it there, and that anyone who wanted to leave could do so because the door wasn't locked. Then he sat down. For about half a minute, no one moved. Then one man stood, and then a second, and then a whole row of chairs, and they walked out without looking at him, without saying goodbye, and the sound of the door closing came back into the room 7 times in a row. When the silence returned, there was exactly one man left in the room. Bruno was still standing where he had been, behind his boss's chair, both hands clasped in front of his stomach. Raphael turned and looked at him. Bruno said only 3 words. "I'm staying." 1 year later, on a street corner on the west side of the city, there was a glass door lit from 11 at night until 4 in the morning. Inside were 12 wooden tables and a long counter, and the menu written in chalk on the blackboard had only 4 dishes, changing from day to day. The place did not serve walk-in customers. It opened for the people who got off work late, waiters, line cooks, dishwashers, hotel receptionists, delivery drivers, the people who had been standing for 10 hours and had nowhere left to sit at that hour. They came in, they sat down, and someone brought food right to their tables. That was the only thing that made this place different from every other place in the city, and it was also the thing that made many people sit after eating for a very long time without saying anything. Delaney Hart stood at the counter, her hair tied back neatly, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. 9-year-old Owen ran between the tables, carrying a stack of menus nobody needed, laughing out loud, stopping at every table to tell some story or other, and everyone there already knew the boy's name. In the kitchen, a man stood at the sink with his sleeves pushed up, washing each bowl, rinsing it, and placing it upside down on the rack to dry. Outside the door, down at the curb, a black car was already parked with its headlights still on and a man sitting inside waiting, Because there are roads people have only gotten halfway down and still have another half to go. Near 1 a.m, the glass door opened. A woman walked in without saying a word, went straight behind the counter, took the apron hanging on the hook, and tied it around her waist. Then she picked up a tray and began carrying food to the tables. No one applauded. No one turned to look. It was the 40-something night she had done that, and in this place they had stopped counting long ago. This story leaves behind something very simple. No one in this world has the right to price a human being's dignity, no matter how much money they have, no matter how high they stand. The strongest person in a room is not the one who makes someone else kneel, but the one who dares to stop and say enough. And what we give when no one is watching: a bouquet of flowers for a stranger, a bowl of hot noodles for someone who hasn't eaten all day, one moment of standing beside someone that can come back years later and change an entire life. Because in this world, no one should have to stand alone. If the story you just heard touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love so they can listen to more compelling stories every day. And please leave a comment below to let us know how you felt about this story, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep in your heart. Wishing you and your family good health, a happy life, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.